Paul's Case, Part 2. The nearer he approached the house, the more absolutely unequal Paul felt to the sight of it all. His ugly sleeping chamber, the cold bathroom, the grimy zinc tub, the cracked mirror, the dripping spigots, his father at the top of the stairs, his hairy legs sticking out from his nightshirt, his feet thrust into carpet slippers. He was so much later than usual that there would certainly be inquiries and reproaches. Paul stopped short before the door. He felt that he couldn't handle a confrontation by his father tonight, that he could not toss again on that miserable bed. He would not go in. He would tell his father that he had no car fare, and it was raining so hard he had gone home with one of the boys and stayed all night. Meanwhile, he was wet and cold. He went around to the back of the house and tried one of the basement windows, found it open, raised it cautiously, and scrambled down the cellar wall to the floor. There he stood, holding his breath, terrified by the noise he had made. But the floor above him was silent, and there was no creak on the stairs, and he found a soapbox and carried it over to the ring of light that streamed from the furnace door and sat down. He was horribly afraid of rats, so he did not try to sleep, but sat looking distrustfully at the dark, still terrified that he might have awakened his father. Suppose his father had heard him getting in at the window and come down and shot him for a burglar. Then again, suppose his father had come down pistol in hand and Paul had cried out in time to save himself. His father horrified to think of how close he nearly had killed him. Then again, suppose a day should come when his father would remember that night and wish there had been no warning cry to stop his hand? With this last thought, Paul entertained himself until daybreak. The following Sunday was fine. The soggy November chill was broken by the last flash of autumnal summer. In the morning, Paul had to go to church and Sunday school as always. And on seasonable Sunday afternoons, the cast of Cordelia Street always sat out on their front stoops and talked to their neighbors on the next stoop or called to those across the street in neighborly fashion. Today, Paul's father sat on the top step, talking to a young man who shifted a restless baby from knee to knee. He happened to be the young man who Paul's father wanted him to model. It was his father's dearest hope that Paul would find his pattern. This young man was of a ruddy complexion, with a compressed red mouth and faded, nearsighted eyes, over which he wore thick spectacles, with gold bows that curved around his ears. He was clerk to one of those great steel corporations, and was looked upon in Cordelia Street as a young man with a future. There was a story that some 5 years ago, he was now barely 26, he had been struggling with finding his future, and in order to curb his appetite and avoid any loss of time, he had taken his boss's advice, and at 21 had married the first woman whom he could persuade to share his fortunes. She happened to be an angular schoolmistress, much older than he, who also wore thick glasses and who bore him 4 children, all nearsighted, like herself. The young man was relating how his boss, now cruising in the Mediterranean, kept in touch with all the details of the business, arranging his office hours on his yacht, just as though he were at home. His father told him, in turn, the plan his corporation was considering expansion, by the way of putting an electric railway plant in Egypt. Paul snapped his teeth. He had an awful apprehension that they might spoil it all before he got there. He prefers to hear these legends in their Iron Kings that were told and retold on Sundays and holidays. These stories of palaces in Venice, yachts on the Mediterranean, and high play at Monte Carlo appealed to his fancy, and he was interested in the triumphs of these cash boys who had become famous, though he had no mind for the cash boy stage. After supper was over and he had helped to dry the dishes, Paul nervously asked his father whether he could go to George's to get some help in his geometry, and nervously asked for car fare. This later request he had to repeat, as his father, on principle, did not like to hear requests for money, whether much or little. He asked Paul whether he could not go to some boy who lived nearer, and told him that he shouldn't to leave his schoolwork until Sunday. But he gave him the dime. He was not a poor man, but he had a worthy ambition to come up in the world. His only reason for allowing Paul to usher at the theater was that he thought a boy ought to be earning a little. Paul bounded up the stairs, scrubbed the greasy odor of the dishwater from his hands with the ill-smelling soap he hated, and then shook over his fingers a few drops of violet water from the bottle he kept hidden in his drawer. He left the house with his geometry conspicuously under his arm, and the moment he got out of Cordelia Street and boarded a downtown car, he shook off the lethargy of 2 deadening days and began to live again. The leading young man of the theater company that played at one of the downtown theaters was an acquaintance of Paul's, and Paul had been invited to drop in at the Sunday night rehearsals whenever he could. For more than a year, Paul had spent every available moment hanging about Charlie Edwards' dressing room. He had won a place among Edwards's following, not only because the young actor, who could not afford to employ a dresser, often found the boy very useful, but because he recognized in Paul something that he also felt inside for himself. It was at the theater and at Carnegie Hall that Paul really lived. The rest was but a sleep and a forgetting. This was Paul's fairy tale, and it had for him all the allurement of a secret love. The moment he inhaled the gassy, painty, dusty odor behind the scenes, he breathed like a prisoner set free, and felt within him the possibility of doing or saying splendid, brilliant, poetic things. The moment the cracked orchestra beat out the overture from Martha, or jerked at the serenade from Rigoletto, all stupid and ugly things slid from him, and his senses were deliciously yet delicately fired. Perhaps it was because, in Paul's world, the natural nearly always wore an ugly disguise, and there was a certain element of phoniness that seemed to him that was beautiful. Perhaps it was because his experience of life elsewhere was full of Sunday school picnics, petty exchanges, ill advice on how to succeed in life, and the inescapable odors of cooking. He found this existence so alluring, attractive theatrical men and women that bloomed under the limelight. It would be difficult to put into words how the stage entrance of that theater was for Paul. An actual portal of romance. Certainly, none of the performers ever suspected it, least of all Charlie Edwards. In the midst of this hazy city, Paul had his secret temple, his wishing carpet, his bit of blue and white Mediterranean shore bathed in perpetual sunshine. Several of Paul's teachers had a theory that his imagination had been perverted by garish fiction, but the truth was that he barely ever read at all. The books at home were not the kind to tempt or corrupt a youthful mind, and as for reading the novels urged upon him by friends, he got what he wanted, which was for music. Any sort of music, from an orchestra to a barrel organ. He needed only the spark, the indescribable thrill that made his imagination the master of his senses, and he could make plots and pictures come to life on his own. It was equally true that he was not stage-struck, not at any rate, but more so an admirer of the expression. He had no desire to become an actor, any more than he had to become a musician. He felt no necessity to any of these things. What he wanted was to see, to be in the atmosphere, float on the wave of it, to be carried out blue league after blue league, carried away from everything. And after a night behind the scenes, Paul found the schoolroom more than ever repulsive, The bare floors and naked walls, the stuffy men who never wore flashy coats or violets in their buttonholes, the women with their dull gowns, shrill voices, and pitiful seriousness about grammar that govern our words. He could not bear to have the other pupils think for a moment that he took these people seriously. He must convey to them that he considered it all trivial, and was only there only because he thought he would play a character in their comedy. He had autographed pictures of all the members of the theater company, which he showed his classmates, telling them the most incredible stories of his relationships with these people, of his friendships with the soloists who came to Carnegie Hall, his meals with them, and the flowers he sent them. When these stories lost their effect and his audience grew unimpressed, he became desperate and would bid all the boys good night, announcing that he was going to travel for a while, going to Naples, to Venice, to Egypt. Then, next Monday, he would slip back, conscious and nervously smiling. He'd claim his sister was ill, and he would have to reschedule his voyage until next spring. Matters went steadily worse with Paul at school. In the itch to let his instructors know how heartily he despised them and their rules, and how thoroughly he was appreciated elsewhere, he mentioned once or twice that he had no time to fool with math problems, adding, with a twitch of the eyebrows and a touch of that nervous bravado which perplexed teachers, and said that he was helping the people down at the theater company. They were old friends of his. The result of the matter was that the principal went to Paul's father, and Paul was taken out of school and put to work. The manager at Carnegie Hall was told to get another usher to replace Paul. The doorkeeper at the theater was warned not to admit him to the house, and Charlie Edwards remorsefully promised the boy's father not to see him again. The members of the stock company were vastly amused when some of Paul's stories reached them, especially the women. They were hard-working women, most of them supporting indigent husbands or brothers, and they laughed rather bitterly at having heard the boy had created such tall tales to his schoolmaster. They agreed with the faculty and with his father that Paul's was a bad case.